start off with our session, which is a social and cultural legacy less examined. Now, for our students, the purpose of an academic conference, and professors, we got them all the time. You know, the days that, oh, Professor so-and-so's at a conference, no class. It's a gathering of scholars who have done research in a particular area from all over the world, sharing their ideas. And that's part of being a professor. Not just teaching, but service and research, offering something new to the dialogue. So here, historically, Paine lived down the street. Iona College and is now the trustee for his papers over in Ryan Library. So now we're sponsoring this to bring people from all around the world who specialize in this topic to share their ideas. And you come away from these things with new insights, new contacts. And that's what we're trying to do here at Iona to make this an annual event. So Dr. Orly Shachar needs no introduction. She, of course, is an esteemed member of the Mass Comm faculty. And on a personal note, she was the chair when I came here, Dr. Eggertsberger and Dr. Petrosh at the same time, and she made us feel so at home and was really a great mentor. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce my mentor in that area. So Dr. Shachar today, her title of her paper is If We Women Have an Equal Right with You in Virtue, the Framing of Gender Roles in Paine's Occasional Letter on the Female Sex in the Equal Rights Amendment Public Discourse.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jack. I'm glad to see so many students sitting here. And as a sort of a continuation to what Jack said, sometimes most of our presentations in conferences are very academic in nature, almost abstract. This one, I hope you'll find an immediate connection. And I brought with me today's New York Times. And in the front section, I found this article titled Connecticut Senate Rivals Spar Over Women's Issues and Jobs in Their Final Debate. So in other words, women's issues were on the agenda, are on the agenda, and unfortunately, I think will be on our public agenda for the time to come. So today I'd like to shed some light on Thomas Paine and his contemporaries' views on women. There has been some widely accepted notion that the radical idea, the founding fathers' idea, that all men were created equal was extended also to include women as well. Therefore, Paine stood, that's what the thinking is, Paine stood at the forefront of the gender agenda. Well, not so fast. So this is a short description of my project. By all account, the idea of women's emancipation found in a 1775 magazine article attributed to Paine is rather surprising. This is more than 200 years ago. The significance of the ideas in the occasional letter on the female sex merits a close examination, particularly in the context of contemporary thoughts regarding women's roles and sex equality. The Equal Right Amendment, I'll refer to it as the ERA, the ERA's public discourse frames some of the major themes similar to the constructs found in that article from 1775. Gender roles as the critical standard for appropriation of rights is at the heart of the 1775 text and also the 1975 public debate. In this presentation, I will compare the constructs of gender roles, expectations, and social norms embedded in the late 1700s text and in the late 1900 arguments, and explore their impacts on the notion of sex equality. So let's start with examining what was the story in the 1700s. Much has been written about the revolutionary ideas of Thomas Paine. His attacks on prescriptive authority and hereditary government were based on a very radical idea at that time that all men were created equal and possessed natural rights. We take it for granted today. That was not the case then. For Paine, the Republican idea of equality and independence was a prerequisite to nurture a just political environment. Paine's ideas were percolating at an increasingly uneasy time period. The concept of discriminatory exclusion from the political process penetrated the political discourse in the late 18th century and struck a sensitive chord with many. In Europe, different voices were calling for liberté, égalité, fraternité, perhaps inspiring the thinkers in America to follow suit. I think it's kind of easy to translate the French: liberty, equality, fraternity. Absent from this public debate about equality were women's rights. The Constitution ratified in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787, made no mention of women. No women were among the 55 delegates who drafted and voted on it. The only reference to women in the Federalist Papers was made in relation to potential peril, potential danger to the state associated with men who are having mistresses. Don't want to tell you what it said. While the particular articles of the Constitution were debated in the days prior to ratification, James Wilson, the delegate from Pennsylvania, actually proposed a resolution calling for specific reference to the legal rights, and I quote, "free citizens and inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition." Wilson's proposal was rejected and was later rephrased by the Committee on Style simply to say free persons, no reference to women in particular. Some historians see women's absence from the Constitution as a natural outcome of the anti-female contract theories of Locke, whose liberal ideas about the social organization of the state gave representation only to male heads of households. The Lockean concept of rights provided white males with the moral authority to challenge their exclusion from the political system, an argument obviously fiercely adopted in America, while segregating women to a non-political realm. The Lockean effect on the Founding Fathers amplified the patriarchal attitude characteristic of men of that time period. In fact, one historian calls the Constitution a legal text of 18th century patriarchy. Chauvinism and excessive patronizing marked the prevailing thinking about women among Paine's male contemporaries. Colonial women were made to transform from British subjects to U.S. citizens, but little was done to extend them the same rights as of their male counterparts. The parallel between British tyrannical rule and male power was not recognized by the thinkers of the time, nor was it discussed in public. Yet few did recognize the association between politics and gender and voiced their concerns in private circles. Abigail Adams visited the issue in her correspondence with her husband, John Adams. Abigail Adams was a really smart woman. She actually said she wanted him to focus on the unlimited power that is assigned to husbands over the wives by common law. She framed her concerns in a concise argument. Remember the times. This was the 1700s. All men would be tyrants if they could. In response to Abigail Adams' reminder to remember the ladies when the Founding Fathers are actually drafting the language of the Constitution, remember the ladies, that's what she wrote to her husband. Her husband, John Adams, dismissed her admonishment, claiming that, and I'm quoting, men would not give up their masculine systems, but they would be fair because in practice, men were the subjects of their wives. Let's not assign much meaning to Adam's reaction because perhaps it was born out of an unwillingness to engage in yet another debate with his very smart wife. Yet his contemporaries paid similar lip service, singing the praise of women and wives, very much, I'm afraid, in the same vein men today introduce their wives as their better halves or admitting to marrying up. For example, Benjamin Franklin's writing, especially in his youth, tended to frequently caricature women as malicious gossips, overly talkative, and domineering. Franklin's early articles depicted women as sexually demanding, haughty, and contentious. Later in his life, his tone softened. Women, he argued, possessed female intuition far more valuable than a man's intellect. Thomas Jefferson, another founding father, the author of the famous words, "All men are created equal," had a very different opinion about women's place in society. He wrote that women should not mix in the gathering of men. Jefferson had similar ideas, and as he wrote to a friend's daughter who was asking about the Constitution, I'm quoting people, "The tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convolution." See why it's so interesting to look at text from far? Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg saw the original understanding of the Founding Fathers as a product of their times. They were bound by the British legal tradition viewing women as suspended during their marriage, and that a married woman is clouded and overshadowed. She possesses nothing. Her husband is her superior and her master. It is important to understand that women's rights were perceived as tantamount to their duties as wives and mothers. A married woman's identity at that time was completely invested in her husband's well-being. Rights were inseparable from duties. The Scottish conception of rights as duties, which absolutely influenced the young America, the young republic at the time, the revolution, even before there was a republic. The Scottish conception of rights as duties allowed men to keep in check the gender hierarchy, while the Lockean approach afforded men, overwhelmingly white, to invent a fresh and daring social framework for the young society in America. Both approaches did not have room for women as political beings. This is the social backdrop in our discussion today for a very special article published in 1775 in the Philadelphia Magazine. Paine's involvement with the magazine, it was also called, by the way, the American Monthly Museum, commenced in February and lasted until August, about 6 months. Paine served as the editor of the publication, excluding its debut issue, and as a contributing editor in some signed pieces, such as the experiments for making saltpeter in private families, and some unsigned or signed under pseudonyms such as Atlanticus or the Old Bachelor. We know about Paine's objectives for the magazine from the lead article in the first issue titled "On the Utility of This Work Evinced." Paine argued that readers with the opportunity to acquiring and communicating knowledge ought always to enlarge with the circle of population. American has now outgrown the state of infancy. Her strength and commerce make large advances to manhood. The magazine carried a broad array of features and articles, from political fables to poems to how-to columns to articles about insects, for example. Paine's choice of mixing subjects was not random. The magazine's use of varied subjects redefined the political and geographical category of what was considered American by transforming it into behavioral category. The colonial populace needed to be socialized into its new role as a new society with distinct characteristics that makes it American and not British. This process was crucial for Paine, as the success of the revolution depended on its outcome. In the hands of Paine, the editor, the magazine was a tool to mold the minds of his contemporaries as a way to forge a new identity, such as the example of the occasional letter on the female sex. It's actually titled An Occasional Letter on the Female Sex. And that is actually a copy of the original magazine. Of course, we have a copy in the archives of the Institute of Thomas Paine, which is housed in our library. So it was really cool for me to go and to see and actually to touch the actual pages from 1775. This is how it looks. You see that it's kind of neat. Letters of different shapes with different spaces, no author, kind of arranged in columns. It's very different from the way magazines are laid out today. Couple of interesting facts about this particular article. It appeared in the August 1775 issue, towards the end of Paine's tenure as the magazine's editor. The article appeared anonymously. Until recently, and that's important, with few exceptions, the authorship of this article was attributed to Paine. Paine was credited as its author and was praised for revolutionary ideas expressed in the article. Recently, a historian by the name of Moran and others traced the article to a Scottish translation of a French text that was first published in Paris 3 years earlier, in 1772, by a member of the French Academy, Antoine Léonard Thomas. The article received, probably in the hands of its editor, Thomas Paine, a 3-line epigraph from Thomas Ottaway's Venice Preserved. Thus, the occasional letter, according to some, is a 1772 French text with changes and additions from Scottish Enlightenment philosophers' text that made its way from France via Edinburgh to a 1775 American publication. At the very least, the movement of this work across national, cultural, and linguistic borders indicates a widespread interest in the theme of women and manners. It started there. The occasional letter is a dizzying account of the state of the relationship between the sexes. Loaded with quotations from different sources, it employed varied writing styles from a third-person narrative to a first-person female perspective. The text opens with a historic review of the relationship between men and women and focuses on the various ills, natural and intentional, that afflict women. The article presents a sweeping geographical panoramic account of the relationship between the sexes over the ages. The text moves rapidly from barbarous nations where more than 1/2 of the globe is covered with savages, to the ancient Spartans, to the Indians of America, to the inhabitants of South America, to Turkey, Persia, India, Japan, and China, to the Mediterranean, Mississippi, the mountain of the Caucasus, and the passing from the Alps and the Pyrenees to the shores of the Baltic. Against this backdrop, the author mobilized the help of Scottish Enlightenment philosophers Adam Ferguson and John Miller, and the British Vice Admiral John Byron. When you read the article, and it's not long, you literally have to stop and catch your breath because it rambles, it goes from one area to another. The text argues that in all parts of the globe, a man exists in a state of barbarity, equally cruel and indolent. He indulges himself in idleness, disdains to assist his wife, consider force as his supreme law, and has never neglected an opportunity to exert his power. In contrast, women are mostly depicted as passive creatures on the receiving end of this prolonged and never-ending brutality and cruelty. Married women are considered in the same view husbands do any other part of their property. They are prisoners who are robbed of freedom of will by the laws, the slaves of opinion who rules them with absolute sway. The text ends with an attempt to narrate a woman's perspective on sex relations. The female rebuttal appears to be rather tamed and conventional, fixed on traditional role of wife and mother as the defining quality of the female sex. Whether the text was in part penned by Paine or went to press as a borrowed text is significant, yet the contextualized outcome is perhaps more revealing. With its inclusion in the August issue of the 1775 magazine, the article was perhaps a poignant message, a very strong message, or an effective tool to channel prevailing ideas from across the pond as a way to set the agenda for the colonial population. Who wrote it as an interesting question, no doubt. But why was it placed in the magazine by Paine in the summer of 1775 is no less important. Perhaps an attempt to answer the latter directs us to discuss the perceived differences between private virtue and public esteem. Both terms are found in an occasional letter. Revolutionary writing of mostly male writers associated virtue with public or military service. Public virtue was regarded as a male quality, binding the individual through service to the community. Yet the late 18th century ideology went through rhetorical transformation of gender-based public virtue. The view of public virtue as solely based on male activities, such as military or civic service, began to include a feminized idea of morality as the perception of individuals' duties began to shift from alliance to a ruler, the king, to a common cause of obligation to the republican nation. The shift allowed for the relocation of identification not with government, but with societal institutions such as churches, schools, and families. Women were perceived as holding the key to helping their husbands and mobilizing their mates and children into the cause. For example, later in his life, Benjamin Franklin advocated for an image of a woman as a helping mate. As he wrote in the Poor Richard Almanac, "A man without a wife is but half a man." He saw some virtue in a hard-working, money-conscious wife, writing, "Frugality is an enriching virtue, a virtue I never could acquire in myself, but I was once lucky enough to find it in a wife who thereby became fortune to me." The discourse of virtue and public esteem is featured prominently in the occasional letter. Virtue and public esteem are mentioned 8 and 3 times respectively. Virtue was first related in the article to South American native women from the Orinoco River region. And it's kind of interesting because there is a short story by that particular name written by a British author that is some sort of a story, a forbidden story love, that is sort of between, if I remember correctly, between a white man and a female black slaves. This particular reference is sympathetic to a female black African slaves who kill their female offspring to save them from an ill-fated destiny. Their virtue is measured in courage, very much like the traditional quality expected of men on the battlefield, killing their offspring, killing the enemy. The author then evokes an Oriental fantasy prevailing in Europe at that time of an Asian harem, filled with wives and concubines and guarded by eunuchs. These female sex slaves are robbed of their human integrity and dignity by their horrid fate. Dehumanized, their virtues are forced. The text continues with a review of the Greek perception of virtuous woman, a woman, and I quote, who is least talked of. In other words, a woman that we don't see, we don't hear about. And ends with references to virtue as a noble characteristics of an individual, man or women. But what is the relations of virtue to public esteem? How does one achieve public esteem, and how does a woman achieve public esteem? Men as well as women may achieve this status based on their actions. The concept of virtue in the text serves to reinforce the ideal of the young republic, since the key to republicanism is virtue, the self-sacrificial quality that was prized in both sacred and secular traditions. Tyranny and patriarchal attitude have no place in a society aspiring to be rid of an oppressive and corruptive ruler. This discourse about virtue and public esteem was dramatically divorced from a discussion about women in the public sphere. The Republican idea of constructing a new citizen, a new American being, free of patriarchal bondages to the king, was creating in the process a gendered definition of citizenship. Women would keep the republic virtuous by serving as wives and mothers. Thus, Republican women were to serve men who served the republic. This idea is the center of the female's discourse towards the end of this article. As a woman, the author defines the frameworks for this perspective for the readers. We're wives and mothers. Sometimes also the name of citizen demands from us the tribute of fortitude. When you offer your blood to the state, that is our. In giving our sons and our husbands, we give more than ourselves. Mobilizing the traditional role of wife and mother to the Republican cause transforms the once very private role to public representation. Thus, women enter the public consciousness, claiming in essence power and recognition once reserved only to men. This ideology was making women relevant in the public arena with a very distinct role. Some call it reproductive labor, which is reduced either to its mere biological meaning or to a form of servitude viewed as appropriately done by women, not fully human slaves or servants. This strategy, characteristics of societies under siege, societies in a state of war, would have a limited success in the years to come on the road to achieving equal rights for women. If the occasional letter was considered as a plea or a call for action to release women from the tyranny of men, its importance lies in its attempt to make a case for women's inclusion in the public sphere with a well-defined role. There may be very little reason to see this article as an early call for equal rights. Instead, it serves to perpetuate a traditional view of women in the service of the young republic. Let me move on to the Equal Rights Amendment. The connections will be made clear a bit later. Let us now turn our eyes to an era about 200 years after the publication of the article. It is now 1975, and one of the hottest items on the public agenda is the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was first introduced by Alice Paul at the 1923 meeting of the National Woman's Party at the Seneca Falls for the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention. The amendment was passed in 1972 and was sent to the states to ratification. Obviously, we're talking about a federal amendment because this is an amendment to the Constitution. 10 years later, the extended deadline for ratification has passed, and the ERA was only 3 states short of the 38 states required to ratify to become the 27th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Since then, the ERA was subsequently reintroduced in every session of Congress, including the current 112th Congress. Today, more than 1/3 of the states have adopted ERA-like amendments into their constitutions. I'm talking about state constitutions, not our federal constitution. Amending the Constitution has never been an easy task. Over the years, more than 11,000 constitutional amendments have been introduced in Congress. Out of 11,000, only 27 have been ratified. 11 of the 27 have been ratified in the 18th century. This is not an easy task. This is it. This is the Equal Rights Amendment. Actually, look at Section 1, because that's the entire amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. The second section actually talks about some procedures. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. The third section reads, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. So literally, the amendment is the first section. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or breached by the United States or any state on account of sex. Why do we need a federal Equal Rights Amendment? Supporters of the ERA argue that a federal amendment carries a symbolic significance as well as a direct instrument for change. This amendment, as do other amendments, serves to raise our consciousness by making us think critically and set a target for our aspirations. The presence of an ERA significantly increases the likelihood of the courts applying a higher standard of law, which in turn significantly increases the likelihood of a decision favoring the equality claim. So in other words, the courts has something to latch on to. Equal treatment of men and women under the law as a constitutional mandate will hold back the courts from applying different laws to women, since a double standard of justice is applied to the classes of men and women. Lower courts may look for firm and conclusive directions from a clear constitutional provision. Judge Newcomer, a federal judge of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, complained that without such an amendment, some judges feel like players at a shell game who are not absolutely sure there is a P. Is there a need, or as some argue, no need for a federal ERA? Opponents of the proposed amendment fear that a protective legislation of women will be removed with the adoption of federal provision. Phyllis Schlafly, for some of you, this is a name from the past. She was the president of the Eagle Forum, a national pro-life organization, believed that the ERA would actually have taken some of women's rights. The amendment would require women to be drafted into military combat anytime men were conscripted, abolish the presumption that the husband should support his wife, and take away Social Security benefits for wives and widows. It would also give federal courts and the federal government enormous new powers to reinterpret every law that makes a distinction based on gender, such as those related to marriage, divorce, and alimony. Also, the amendment's blind indifference to sex creates a problem for some who argue that the fact that men and women are physiologically different should and can be used as a justification in some statutes, such as the statutory rape laws. Critics point to a possible gap in the amendment precisely because it is just too vague and too specific at the same time, and may leave too many opportunities for the courts to decide. Others argue that most constitutional amendments are irrelevant since they don't predict change, as they are usually ratified after social changes have taken place. Enormous public debate commenced around that time. The fight over the ERA reflects a wider tension between the traditional view of women as mothers and wives and men as breadwinners, and the more contemporary approach that assigns professional and anti-family care roles to both sexes interchangeably. This gap in opinion is not new. This gap in opinion is very relevant today as well. The ERA public discourse was framed as a fight for democratic values of justice and equality. The push for ratification at the time was constructed as a women's struggle, as women's struggle against oppression and a battle against tyranny. Now, what I did is looked at some media portrayal of both arguments, for and against. Picture an arrow flying toward a target on the back of the enemy. And the enemy in that public discourse was definitely men. The ERA debate featured women's status as a moving standard compared to men's. Are women inferior or superior to men was the basic question in the debate. One particular image was used over and over again, the pedestal, as a reflection of public esteem. Now, it begins to sound familiar because in the 1975 public debate, we're talking about a pedestal. In the letter in 1775, we're talking about public esteem. We're talking about something similar. Opponents of the ERA emphasize the value of keeping up with tradition, while the proponents argued that the other sex occupied the elevated status. Sheffield and her supporters were in favor of maintaining the pedestal status for women, while some of her opponents clamored for knocking down the pedestal altogether. The metaphor of the pedestal was a difficult-to-resist frame by the ERA's female opponents. Like the letter's public esteem, the pedestal was framed as a desirable place or state for women. For example, in a 1975 Chicago Tribune's piece titled "Voice of the People," and I quote, the writer cries out, "I'll be darned if I appreciate trading the lofty pedestal on which men have held me and which I try to deserve for mere equality." The Oklahoma City Times ran an editorial with the following quote accompanying a picture of a woman in a coal mine. Again quote, "Haven't we treated you well? Don't you like being on a pedestal? Do you really want to dig coal? Do you want to give up the advantage you have in the divorce court?" To sum up, the Phyllis Schlafly reports asked women, should we lower ourselves to equal right when we already have the status of special privilege? The pedestal was framed by the ERA supporters as a cage, and the barriers restricting women's lives were compared to glass walls. Some even used the frame as a musical chair, reversing the sexes and suggesting men put themselves on pedestals. A Chicago Tribune column described, and I quote, "Men who oppose ERA as aren't concerned about keeping women on pedestals, but in having women around to dust the pedestals they build for themselves." Today, psychologists have referred to women's idealization as benevolent sexism. The idea that women ought to be protected, supported, and adored, and whose love is necessary to make a man complete, afford men an opportunity to view women as weak and best suited for conventional gender roles. Being put on a pedestal is confining, but may be interpreted by society and men in particular as socially acceptable. Further, modern research of the impacts of benevolent sexism on disadvantaged groups argue that such stereotyping lead to rationalization of equality and justification of the status quo. So let's just put everything together and look at the common rhetorics in the letter, the occasional letter on the female sex, and in the ERA debate. If the occasional letter charged men as the source, perpetrator, and enforcer of women's inferior status, the ERA proponents position men as selfish guards against progress. In 1775, as in 1975, women were framed as manipulated pawns in the hands of men. Nothing much has changed in those 200 years. The pedestal of public esteem rhetoric strategy was employed for political gain. A society undergoing major upheaval, mobilizing its members to commit to its survival. In 1775, with the beginning of the American Revolution, the publication of the occasional letter on the female sex is not surprising. This public declaration in favor of women's traditional roles called for inversion of women's place in society, making the private domain public by externalizing their domestic responsibilities. In the young republic, women were not assigned new roles, nor did the occasional letter was purporting to change women's lot. Instead, traditional roles were to be fitted with a service component, affording women a place in the public discourse. Thus, in 1775, women were drafted to the cause not as equal partners, but as supporting actors. The letter was simply asking women to assume their position on a pedestal as nurturers of those in charge of constructing the new society. And if you examine actually the public discourse, the binders and all of that is happening today, one can argue that this project can continue to look at the pedestal metaphor in today's, perhaps, newspapers and magazine articles and find similarities. Thank you.